Good morning. This is Lydia Ford. Um, this is Lydia Ford. I didn't plan to come on this morning, so this is kind of sporadic. But this morning, I want to talk to you from this topic: 5 signs you're dealing with unresolved grief. I am Lydia Ford, a certified grief counselor. My grief business is called Grace to Win. And so bear with me for a few minutes while I talk to you about unresolved grief and 5 signs that you may not be doing as well in the area of grieving and accepting it and choosing to do the grief work to thrive, to accept, to learn how to live without that individual loved one. Also, to know and understand that your purpose, the plan that your creator has for you is bigger than your grief, and your losses are never tied to your purpose. Your creator still has a great, awesome plan for your life. And I often say to people, as I talk about grief, that you can have Jesus or uh, whoever your higher power is, the one that you pray to. You can have Jesus and you can have therapy as well. The two is a great fit. They go together if you allow it to. So let's talk about 5 signs that you're dealing with unresolved grief. Grief is normal, a natural reaction to loss, such as the death of a loved one. And the grieving process looks different for each person going through it. It is entirely unique to the individual that's going through it, because when you lose a loved one, that is so personal, and your relationship to the individual that is no longer a part of your life instructs us that you're not going to grieve in the same way that another person grieves, even if they also lost a mother, a father, a sibling, a child. You're going to relate differently to someone else in that position because your relationship with that person was different. All right. So grief is unique to an individual based on the relationship that they had with the person that is no longer here. In general, though, the most intense period of grieving typically happens in the first 6 months after a loss and recurs through the first 2 years, said therapist Andrea Dorn, noting that this timeline can also vary widely from person to person. And while it's common, it is common to experience occasional waves of grief for years or even decades after a loss. Most people will notice a gradual, I'm try to put these words down a little lower. Most people will notice a gradual decline in the frequency and the duration of grief symptoms over time as they work, as they do grief work through these feelings, says Dorn, the author of When Somebody Dies, a child's mindful how to guide on grief and loss. I'll repeat that. According to therapist Dorn or author Dorn, who wrote this book, When Someone Dies, a children's mindful how to guide on grief and loss. But sometimes the intense period of suffering does not let up. It does not subside. It doesn't get less. You may get stuck. I said, you may get stuck in your grief and feel like you cannot move forward. Okay. I often say that I help people who are stuck in grief to get unstuck. I know you've heard me say that many times. This is known as unresolved grief. In clinical terms, it may be referred to as complicated grief or prolonged grief, which is a condition. It's called grief disorder. And grief disorder or complicated grief became an official mental health diagnosis in 2021. Okay. And you can read about that in the American Psychiatric Association on their website. Okay. complicated or prolonged grief or grief disorder. Read about it on the website of the American Psychiatric Association. So, unresolved grief is a type of grief where a person continues to experience significant emotional distress, pain, and sadness associated with a loss long, long, long after the normal grieving period has passed, says Dorn, who is also the founder of Bloom Therapy and Wellness in Columbia, South Carolina. So this can happen when somebody has not had the opportunity to fully process or come to terms with their loss. This can happen when you do not engage a therapist or a counselor or someone in the area of healthcare, where you've not done the grief work and come to terms with the loss of a loved one. And the only way to reach calmer waters is through the storm. You got to go through the storm. And the only way through grief is to actually experience it. Here's an analogy that highlights the difference between normal grief or typical grief and unresolved or complicated grief. Imagine a ship caught in a storm. Waves may crash onto the deck, leaving the passengers disoriented, overwhelmed, and drained. However, in normal grief, the storm eventually subsides, allowing the ship to sail onto calmer waters. However, conversely, the opposite of that is unresolved grief feels like being trapped in the eye of the storm, where the chaos around you may diminish slightly, but the sense of being stuck still remains. The state of grief can create a sense of loneliness and confusion. I should say, this state of grief can create a sense of loneliness and confusion, making it difficult to see your life clearly. So wading through the rough waters to reach calmer ones may feel too daunting, out of sight, can't do it, nowhere to be found. So the person ends up staying put. They end up staying stuck in their grief, which can not only be exhausting, it can also prevent a person from being able to process and resolve their grief. The only way to reach calmer shores is through the storm. And the only way through the storm or through your grief is you got to feel it. You got to feel that pain. And sometimes you got to agonize over it. You got to wrestle with it. You got to experience it. You got to talk about it. Certain factors are more likely to lead to unresolved grief. For example, a sudden or traumatic death. You're already dealing with some type of loss, and then all of a sudden, here comes another. Okay, here comes another loss. Here comes another one. Back to back losses. Okay, death, your closeness to the person who died, a lack of social support, and pre-existing medical health conditions or emotional struggles add to this unresolved grief that you're experiencing. A grief therapist, such as myself, wants to share what unresolved grief looks like on this post so you can identify it and get the help you need to move forward. Not to be stuck in grief, not to just cope with it, not to just survive it, all right, but to win and to thrive and to go on to your purpose, to your destiny, to a place where you have left a messy situation, or you've left a place of testing and trial and trauma. But now, because you've done the grief work, you've resolved this complicated grief that is encumbering your life. You go on after you've done the grief work to now winning and not being a victim, but a victor, and going on to live your best life and going on to learn lessons, going on to experience or show someone else how to get to the other end of their own grief and problems that they've been having with unresolved grief. So here's Number one, I'm talking about 5 signs you're dealing with unresolved grief. Here's number one. You feel persistent and intense, painful emotions about the death. You feel persistent, ongoing, and intense, painful emotions about that death. You often feel overwhelmed by feeling such a sadness and anger, yearning, or despair related to the loss that make it difficult to function. Sometimes even getting out of your bed is not even something that you're able to do, not even on your mind. You may feel as though you are stuck in a cycle of grief, like Groundhog Day, stuck in a cycle of grief. You can't escape. And you may struggle to find joy or pleasure in other aspects of your life. If you're still feeling unrelented sadness and anger or despair long after a loss, that may be a sign of unresolved grief. All right? That may be a sign of unresolved grief. Here, for example, those whose loved one died by suicide, watch this, must wade through the emotional devastation and, watch this, the stigma that accompanies a suicide death. There's such a stigma that accompanies a suicide death. A lot of it stems from the families, where they came from, their culture, their background, and some of it stems from their ethnicity. We call the stigmatized death, or death by suicide, we call that disenfranchised grief, because a lot of times it's taboo. People don't want to be around people who they have known to take their life, or families that had an individual that took their life. We feel some kind of way about that, sometimes because of religion. All right. Because in our religion, we attach things like that, say that if you took your life, then you're not going to heaven. You can't possibly get to heaven because this person took their life. We call that disenfranchised grief, because you don't get a lot of support for that. You might get some in the beginning, but after a while, people don't want to touch that, because it's in some places it's taboo. In some cultures, in some churches and denominations, it's taboo. For some, the unprocessed grief may show up as increased anxiety or agitation, causing strong reactions to seemingly small events in your life. Okay, so that's number one. You feel persistent and intense, painful emotions. You can't get away from there. You look and it's at the north, it's at the south, it's at the east, it's above you, it's below you, it's all around you. You can't sleep. Okay. Here's number two. You avoid or cling to reminders of the person who has died. You may notice you're actively avoiding places and hobbies or other people that remind you of the loved one you lost, because it's too painful. Here's an example. You may avoid going to the cemetery, looking at photos of your loved one, or participating in activities that you once enjoyed doing together. This can make it difficult to maintain social connections and engage in activities that actually can promote your healing. And on the other end of the spectrum, you might find yourself constantly seeking out reminders of this person. Watch this, by touching their belongings, for example, or, there have been incidences of people, wives whose husbands have died, mothers, fathers whose children have died, that they left completely their bedroom the same way it was when they died. Nothing added, nothing taken away. It's as if that person never died. Here's number three. You're consumed by inaccurate or unhelpful thoughts about their death. Consumed, overwhelmed with inaccurate or fake or unhelpful thoughts about their death. Inaccurate thoughts are those that don't reflect the facts around the death. That might include blaming yourself for things that were beyond your control. Blaming, shaming, feeling guilty about that person's death, and it was way beyond your control. For example, someone taking complete responsibility for a bad choice that someone else made that may have contributed to their loved one's death. All right. Unhelpful thoughts may have some truth to them, but they fill you with negative emotions like guilt, like helplessness and hopelessness and shame and blame. Here's another example. Having thoughts like, I don't care about what happens to me in the future if my loved one isn't going to be here to partake of it. She'll never see me graduate. So what's the point? She'll never see me, or he'll never see me my dad will never see me get married. Okay. My parents will never see me graduate. So you're being consumed by inaccurate or unhelpful thoughts about their death. Here's another one. I blame myself. I feel guilty because I didn't get to the hospital on time. I had to report to work. I got a call at the last minute. Something interfered with me leaving right away. So now you're feeling guilty by something that you could not control. You're blaming, you feel shame, okay? You're feeling helpless and hopeless. That's number 3, consumed by inaccurate or unhelpful thoughts about the death. Here's 4. You're having trouble accepting the reality that this person is gone, and most of us are there. I've been there, done that, got a t-shirt. Trouble accepting the reality that the person is gone. And that happens in the first days, weeks, months, sometimes 6 months, sometimes even a year after that person has died. And you still wake up in the morning thinking that that person should still be here. You may struggle to come to terms with the loss, experiencing denial or disbelief about that person's death. You may find yourself constantly searching for signs or signals that your loved one is still here. This can interfere with the process of mourning and prevent you from fully processing your emotions related to that loss. That was number 4. Disbelief. All right. Disbelief about the person's death and not accepting the reality that this person is gone and they are not coming back. All right. That's number 4. Here's 5, and I'm almost done. You're engaging in numbing behaviors, feeling numb. You may turn to drugs, alcohol, or food to dull the emotional pain. I know in the first hours, moments, even after someone comes to you and say, I'm sorry, maybe that was the surgeon or whoever, I'm sorry, it could be a police officer, I'm sorry, but your loved one died in an accident. I'm sorry, but we did all we could in surgery, but we couldn't bring him or her back to life. You become numb, all right? You're in shock. And shock sometimes produces a numbing reaction, emotional reaction. So number 5, you're engaging in numbing behaviors. You know, when that happens, when you still are feeling numb after days and weeks and months, people can turn to drugs or alcohol or food to dull. Because you know what numbing is? When the dentist has to fill a cavity or take a tooth out, they fill your jaw, your gums with Novocaine or some other type of numbing medication, and you don't feel anything. All right. Sometimes people walk around for weeks, days, months, years, and they're still numb from the death of a loved one. So they numb their pain. They disassociate it. They numb it by turning to drugs and alcohol, sex, even food to dull the pain. And that can lead to engagement in substance abuse, self-defeating behaviors like overeating or numbing with screens or sleep, and sometimes suicidal ideations. And leaning on your support system is so important when you're feeling that numbing pain, that numbing sensation. Like getting up is not even on your mind. So leaning on your support system is so important when you're trying to process unresolved grief. So if any of these 4 sound familiar to you, I'm going to go back over them. You feel persistent and intense, painful emotions about death. Now, this is not normal. This is after some time, maybe 6 months, a year, 2 years. If you're still having these signs, persistent, intense, painful emotions after death, if you're still trying to avoid or cling to reminders of the person who has died, meaning you've not cleared out their room, the room looks exactly the way it was before they died. Okay. Number three, you're consumed by inaccurate or unhelpful thoughts about their death. You're blaming yourself because that person did something unhelpful that may have contributed to their death, and you're blaming yourself. You're consumed with inaccurate, unhealthy thoughts. That's number three. Four, you having trouble accepting the reality of that this person is gone. And number five, engaging in numbing behaviors, turning to substance abuse or self-defeating behaviors like overeating or numbing. All right. Expressing suicidal ideations. So if any of this seems familiar, here's some advice on how to move ahead. Unresolved grief can make you feel isolated from the people and things you care about, but building a strong support system is crucial. For example, family, friends, a grief group, or your spiritual or religious community can help you. And a therapist, a counselor. Talking to others who have experienced a similar loss can be particularly helpful in feeling understood and less alone. Allowing yourself to grieve rather than suppressing or avoiding difficult emotions or grief emotions. Let me help you. It's perfectly normal. Okay. It is also important. It is also an important part of healing. Crying, the act of crying, is such an important part to healing. It's okay to experience a range of emotions when grieving, including sadness, anger, guilt, or regret. All right, that's normal. Allow yourself to feel these emotions and acknowledge that they are a normal part of the grieving process. Finding ways to honor, watch this. We must learn how to find, and I've had to learn this over my life, over the times when I was in deep trauma, grief, and sadness. You have to learn to find ways to honor or memorialize or stay connected to the person you lost. Okay. Finding ways to honor, finding ways to remember, finding ways to memorialize that person you lost can also be beneficial. There have been many people that have started nonprofits, many people that have started businesses and ministries, many people that have found ways to celebrate the anniversary. We call it the anniversaries of the first year without them. Okay, the actual date that they died, the first Christmas that you had to go on without them, the first Easter, the first Thanksgiving, their first birthday, your first birthday without them. We must find ways to honor, memorialize, and remember that person. These are things that are beneficial. They are best practices, and they are helpful. This can include creating a memorial, watch this, writing a letter to the person, or participating in activities that they enjoyed, especially on the anniversary of the first. Finding ways to keep the memory of your loved one alive can help with the grieving process and provide comfort. I remember that for the first couple of years, my daughter succumbed to pancreatic cancer. For the first couple of years, my son-in-law, Jameis, started a walk-a-thon in memory of my daughter, his wife, Danielle. Danielle was her name, Danielle Ford Jeter, and even their infant child participated in those first couple of walk-a-thons. They had shirts made up in purple and engaged their community, engaged their faith community. And I even came down from Connecticut to participate, and some of my family members also in that walk-a-thon the first couple of years after her death. Okay, so there are ways that you can celebrate, you can memorialize, you can remember your loved one. Here's something else. Finding ways to keep the memory of your loved one alive can help with the grieving process and provide comfort. If you had, watch this is important. If you had a difficult, or if you had a toxic relationship with the deceased, you can still do the letter writing exercise, or you might choose to express your feelings some other way. One of the ways that I include in my grief counseling is especially if the client has had a toxic or difficult relationship with that person, is through the empty chair. Put an empty chair in the middle of wherever, in your house, in your room, your kitchen, wherever, and talk to that person. Start a conversation. Talk to that person about things that were unresolved in the relationship, conflicts. Maybe the last time you engaged in a conversation, it might not have been a good one. It might have been an argument. Talk to that person and tell them from the heart why you think they misunderstood you or you misunderstood them. Talk to them about, how much you wish things could have gone better between you. Talk to them about a hurtful or an offensive situation that occurred between the two of you. Find something positive to say to that individual that you didn't get to say to them while they were alive. And now they're dead. They can't hear you, but we can use the empty chair to rid ourselves from toxic emotions inside of us that we never were able to rid ourselves of. That the empty chair is good catharsis for emptying out toxic emotions. Letter writing, write a letter to your loved one, expressing how much you miss them, expressing the things that you used to do with them that now you are reluctant to do because they're not there. All right. So letter writing, journaling is also very important, or a ritual, something you did annually, a ritual that you did with your loved one. Recreate it. Do it with the loved ones that are still there. Do it with the loved ones that are still around you, your friends, your family, your church members. Okay. Taking care of yourself physically and emotionally will also help you move forward. So prioritize sleep, prioritize moving, okay, walking, running, and nourishing foods. Eat balanced foods, all right, as well as getting back into activities that bring you joy and actually relax you, while you still are acknowledging that at this time, this may feel impossible. It might be, uncomfortable. And you know what? You can expect setbacks and occasional painful reminders. I have them myself. Some days are better than others. But finding a good therapist who specializes in grief, or more specifically, in complicated grief, can also be a valuable resource. A therapist like myself can help you explore your emotions related to loss, identify patterns of thinking that may be contributing to your difficulties, and provide tools and strategies to cope with grief. And keep in mind that grieving can be a lifelong process, although I try not to instill that in my clients, because grief is not linear. It doesn't move in a straight line. It's like the ocean. It's like the waves. It comes in waves. All right. And keep in mind also, it's not a one and done situation. All right. It's not a 12-step situation that occur in some substance abuse programs, like, chemical, drugs, alcohol. It's not like that. Okay. So try not to get hung up on time frames. It's important to expect setbacks and occasional painful reminders. And some days are better than others. All right. But understanding this framework allows you to be better prepared through the grieving process, knowing that it's not a one-stop thing. It's not a 12-step thing. Okay. It's not linear. It doesn't even move according to the 5 steps of grief. All right. That are sometimes we as clinicians have learned about. All right. It's like the Kubler-Ross 5 or 6 steps to grief. It doesn't always move like that. All right. The goal of processing grief isn't to move on, according to Dorn, but to find a way to integrate the loss into your life in such a way that allows you to move forward. And sometimes that movement is slow, but you have a sense of peace and acceptance, even though it's slowly evolving. You're still moving ahead. All right. Unresolved grief prevents much, if not all, of that forward movement. I said unresolved or complicated grief, according to those five signs that I talked about, make all of your forward, it negates your forward momentum. So if you got to go slow, go slow, go at your own pace. All right. Nobody's timing you, especially if you have signed up with a grief counselor or you're using a therapist. We're not interested in how fast you can move in terms of unresolved grief, normal grief, or even complicated grief. You got to move at your own pace. And a good therapist is not going to force you to go faster than what you are able. So I hope I have helped you this morning with dealing with and talking about the five signs that you might be in complicated grief, or you're dealing with unresolved grief. If you or someone you know needs help, if they're suicidal, talking about suicidal, or their movements or their behaviors suggest that they might be not in a really good place, make sure you dial 988. I'm going to put that in the notes. All right. I'm going to put that in the notes, and I'm going to type it there. I'll type it. I won't type it while I'm live. Well, I will type it. If you or, let's see here. I'll take that on. If you or someone you know is experiencing ideations, call 988. And I'm glad that they changed it and shortened it. There's also there is the 1-800 number, or so I'm going to put it 1-800-273-8255. So use that number, call that number. If you or somebody you know is experiencing suicidal ideations, call 988 or call 1-800-273-8255. And that's for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. So there it is in the chat. Okay. They even have one via text by visiting even outside of the United States. So you can visit the International Association for Suicide Prevention. Let me type that in. I just text that one. There is also a national suicide link, and it is called, and I'm typing this, it is tied. It is called, I should say, International Association of Suicide Prevention. Let me make sure that I spelled everything right. I want to make sure. And I'm typing in small letters. So there is also the International Association of Suicide Prevention. So you can also get in touch with those agencies. Thank you for your time. This is Pastor Lydia Ford. I help people who are stuck in grief to get unstuck. I am a licensed grief counselor. And I'm going to say this. I deal with mostly normal grief patterns, normal grieving over loved ones. There are other levels of grief counseling. So my level is at the normal range. I don't deal with complicated. I'm not authorized, I should say, haven't gone to school to matriculate in the area of complicated grief. However, when I begin counseling with clients, if I feel after some time they're not responding to treatment, that they're really dug in an abnormal grief patterns, complicated grief, they're not, these things that I mentioned, these 5 signs are not being resolved, then I will refer out to someone, to another health clinician, to another grief counselor that is more capable, more knowledgeable in the area of complicated grief. Okay. So that might be my next step, my next certification to go more into complicated grief. But I deal mostly in the area of normal grief. All right. So I just wanted to put that in there because sometimes we get outside of our grade and we think that we can help everybody. There's some people you just can't help. And so you have to refer out. All right. Even people that are in pastoral counseling, they've taken pastoral counseling classes and courses, all right? And they are a pastor over their church. Sometimes when people come to them, they are limited in their scope of what they can do or add to that person who's grieving, who has gone past the normal stages of grief, all right? So some of them may need a mental health clinician. They might need a psychiatrist, a psychologist. So even as pastors, we have to be very, have discernment and know when we cannot handle what that person actually is going through and what they actually need. So we have to make sure that we refer out to someone else that is better capable, more knowledgeable, and certified in mental health issues like suicide and schizophrenia, bipolar, those types of other mental diseases, okay, or handicaps. So I wanted to also put that in there. All right. So I pray that I said something today. You can contact me. All of my information is scrolling at the bottom of the screen. Again, I'm Lydia Ford. I help people who are stuck in grief to get unstuck. My grief counseling services is called Grace to Win. And it's the number 2. You can contact me on my Facebook page, or you can contact and reach me at my email address, which is lydiaford52@gmail.com. Y'all have a blessed day. Bye.